Hello and welcome to WoW with AI. This is the AuxoAI podcast, and where we actually start talking about the future of work and how AI is actually changing not the technology aspect of it, but how the work aspect of it, and how the innovation is creeping into our daily lives. And no better person to start that discussion with, and no better topic than in the topic of customer experience, and no better person than Katie Stein. So, Katie, who is the CEO of IGT Solutions, who are a strategic partner with AuxoAI also. So I'm very pleased to have her with me for this discussion. Katie, welcome.
Thanks, Amaresh. It's so great to be with you always.
Likewise, likewise. So, Katie, what we are going to talk about is kind of the from the front lines view of how work is changing in the CX space.
Yeah.
Whether it's contact centers, chats, or the calls that should not happen, and we'll do that. And we'll do it in a series. As we talked about, we'll probably do it in a series. And let's focus on this broader notion of, I mean, you've been a CEO for a year there of a large contact center customer experience company, and obviously there's a whole host of things in AI happening, and you and I have in the past worked a lot on things on AI. So from your vantage point, from like what's happening in the CX space, what are the big themes that are emerging in what is CX and AI intersection?
Yeah. So maybe even before we jump like right into the work of
Yes.
our conversation, Amrish, I'll explain for the audience who may not know us, IGT Solutions, we have about 25,000 agents, 30 locations, global. A large portion of our business is with travel and transportation and hospitality. But really, we think of ourselves as serving any type of experience, customer experience across industry verticals. But that basis in travel, transportation, hospitality, and I'll use a lot of examples from that over the next couple sessions, is so important because it's one of those few examples of an industry where there is no product.
Mhm.
Um, you know, in many industries, you receive a product, you determine really your satisfaction and the success based on the product and how it performs. In when you think about it, a vacation context or a work travel context, there isn't a product you go home with at the end. It's the experience of that journey. And so things that have become very, talked about in our world of journeys becomes really important because any disintermediation, any disruption in that journey changes your view of the brands that touched you in that journey dramatically.
Right.
And so when we think about what everyone's striving for in travel, transportation, and hospitality, or more broadly, is how do we create more loyalty, right? How do we create more customer success? And at the end of the day, this is one of the hardest industries because any disruption can impact the brand and your loyalty to that brand. So just as context as we talk through this, but let's back to you and I remember, gosh, it was a couple months ago when we were talking about Klarna and we were saying it's amazing what ripples they can send through the industry with these messages around where AI will impact the world. And I think a lot of the research I'm seeing recently, and I'd be curious on your view, is people are saying, hey, is AI really going to shake things up? Meaning, turn industry on its head, eliminate jobs, change work to where it's, really um, just technology doing the work? Or is this something different? Right? Are we rethinking that now? We've sort of gotten over this hype cycle of the first GPT releases, and now we're sort of saying to ourselves, like, what is the future of work? And in a contact center where it's been a human skilled environment, really what we sell is people and language and skilling of those people. What happens when technology now takes a new shape? And can, because it doesn't have to be a bot, it doesn't have to be rules based. But I'd be curious whether, your thoughts on just sort of whether you're seeing a shift in the narrative broadly, and then we can jump in a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the broad narrative, I think there are two broad narratives around it. One is, I think, what I call the AI doomerism has subsided, right? I think people are a lot more like, oh, this is useful, but there's a lot more work to be done. So
Yeah.
I think that there's a much more realism and from an enterprise perspective, and how we're talking to our kind of our clients, which actually is a much better place to be than, oh, this is magic bullet, or this is going to finish everything, right? So that's what
Yep.
we are I think in a good medium at least right now.
Yep.
I think the second piece of it is as people are doing a bunch of experiments, they're doing some work. What they are realizing is there are two broad type of benefits that are starting to accumulate. One is uh, knowledge work by and large has never been standardized, right? I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot we try to standardize SOPs, and there are kind of how you do a sales process, how you kind of pick up a customer call and respond to it. But the reality is there's a high degree of variability around that, and for a good reason. And so part of it is there are some pieces of it that you standardize, and that is starting to it allows you to standardize actually very much more better from a back end. So that actually drives some value. And the second is AI also allows you to be non-standard, which allows the customer to drive the flow and be okay with it, and the system adapts to it. So this brought this dual notion about some degree of standardization that didn't exist, which actually helps a lot of people who were early in their career or not as skilled, and at the same time being allow you to break the rules and be non-standard when it is needed. And I think both of those things fundamentally stress the workflows and the technology systems a lot, which I think is the foundation of what the future of these jobs is going to look like role by role. I think is
Yeah,
what's going to emerge.
I agree. And so, you and I know this because one of the ways that AuxoAI and IGT have been working together is really almost on patient zero, which is
Yes.
what we started to work together on was how do we rewire our entire operating model around people, which starts with, training, skilling, of course, recruiting, but we really came into a use case that we've been working together jointly on around how do we enable agents? And I think I'll come back to that in a second. The second one is obviously where everyone talks about, which is agent assist, which is your co-pilots and persistence of knowledge. And I think you touched on that, so I'll come back. And then the third is really around how do we augment, let humans be more human, amplify that human part of the connection in a contact center environment, but standardize and automate pieces of work or tasks that don't have to be done by a human. And now we can do it at a velocity or scale we couldn't do before. But the thing that you triggered for me in there on the first part, which is really around how do we enable. So when you think about in any contact center environment, just the level of attrition, and we all know this, and the velocity of which talent comes through any organization is quite high. So how do you get the agent who doesn't have the experience to a level where they're proficient and skilled and can deliver consistent quality faster and better? I think it was you sent me an article, it was maybe 6 months ago, which started a lot of this conversation around, the top quartile performers, to be honest, the assist doesn't do much for them. They've got the basic skills. They are the knowledge worker. The bottom quartile can improve 20, 30% at a much faster clip. And the thing that I was reading about the other day is really it's not so much just the search of information, it's the persistence of being able to get the information served up in front of them so that they get pattern recognition much faster than a traditional environment. And I think that's something that is under discussed in the industry at large, which is really how do we use this in a training environment versus an agent, assist environment where it's a co-pilot. And I think there's the opportunity, at least in call centers, where standardization of the interaction is so volatile and so variable that getting to that, because you can't control the input variable. You can't control what your situation, Amresh, is, what you're facing in your vacation, your work travel, bad weather, all these things. It's not one, it's usually a multitude of things coming together. And the agent is there trying to receive and apply a standard policy to then help you navigate that. So I think it's really interesting how this is going to evolve in terms of that initial bucket, which is really about enablement.
Do you see enablement as the broader use case? I mean, you laid out a great framework, enablement, assist, and augment, right? Kind of like
Yeah.
where, and this is from an agent perspective right now.
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, like from a human perspective, working and
Yeah.
helping. Do you see more take up on the enablement side over assist and augment, or like where is the industry right now?
In my mind, the first two buckets, enablement and assist, are where most of the use cases I see happening. On the enablement, one of the reasons I'm so focused on driving that use case, and let's say, like in the generic terms, and this is what I really love, about all the hype in this, is that people can say, oh yeah, we're going to use it for training, but what does that really mean? Like, where are the gaps? Where is it the training isn't working?
Mm.
Right. So one of the use cases that your team and our team are working together on is chat. And it's something as simple as, if you think about it, in the traditional model, an agent is trained on a singular chat. Well, for most people, to start and complete a task is how our brain operates. When you go into actually a live environment and you're in production or on the job, you're dealing with probably 3 chats simultaneously or concurrently. Because the idea is that, the end customer on the other end is taking time to respond, they're doing something else. And so for sheer utilization and capacity, they're dealing with more than one at a time. That becomes very hard for the human mind to track three different streams of thought and be responding accurately and consistently. Three different problems they may be solving at the same time. I mean, think about that. How often do we sit down and solve three different problems at the same time? And so I think as you get into this training, not only is it allowing us to unlock some of these areas, which takes stress off agents, it makes them more productive and more consistent, but it also teaches them to trust AI.
Right.
I mean, these are many times people who have no technology training, and you're basically creating, I mean, it's back to the old adage of like citizen developers, right? Like you're training them to trust and be proficient using AI at the most foundational level, which in my mind then makes them more receptive to when you get into a co-pilot agent assist kind of environment when they're doing their work. And so I think that's an important part. Like you've heard a lot about change management. I think change management happens best in contextual learning.
Yeah.
And that's why training is such an interesting place to really introduce this as something where it's just how they learn to do their job, you
Yeah,
know?
that's on the consumer and the customer side. Right?
Yeah.
Let's start with the consumer side. Is the expectation or experience expectation of consumers, have you seen that changing as you're kind of helping them?
Yeah. So, we are focused right now tremendously on using AI to automate behind the scenes. So, what are great use cases? Great use cases are post-call transcript, right? Before an agent had to go back and do that work, that can be automated now. We're using it to assist agents with next best action prompts, interaction analytics. We're using it for all of these things. We ourselves have not seen tremendous uptake in our industries that we serve yet with letting autonomous agents interact with end users. I think when I think about it, I think that just like I talked about the agent's level of trust, we still see in research. I mean, Gartner did a great piece a couple of months ago where end consumers themselves are still wary of interacting with an AI agent. Interestingly, we're much more prone to interact over chat, right? And if you think about it, we don't really know who's behind the chat, but there is still this barrier of trust. And that's why I think as an industry, this sort of idea of safety, security, ethics, ethical use of AI is something we have to keep talking about and talk about in a language where the end consumer or the brand between us and the end consumer understands that we're putting those guardrails in place. And I know you and I have spent a ton of time on that.
And then
Yeah.
the third stakeholder in that whole equation, which is the companies themselves. I mean, in your case, the airline and hotel companies, clients, I mean, just from an enterprise perspective, where are they in this whole AI and CX? I mean, you had an agent view of it, your end customer consumer view of it. Where are
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I've been thinking about this a lot. Like when you go to a boardroom level discussion, I can't imagine a boardroom that isn't asking for what is our view on AI? What is our AI stance? What are we investing around AI? But AI, has become almost convoluted with generative AI, right? And I think that I was talking to an individual who runs analytics for a very large airline, and she was saying, and it really struck me. She said, "Look, at the end of the day, when I think about our P&L and how we make money, getting another 5% of productivity out of this workforce or this piece of our operations is interesting, but it's nothing compared to what, for example, quantum computing and machine learning can do for repositioning our planes and making sure that on time and full, and so I think that it's actually now a question more of what is the technology architecture that's going to enable companies to be competitive. And all this research that says like companies that have generative AI will be 25% faster growing than others. I actually think we've sort of taken a tagline and we're missing that there's many different disciplines under this broad umbrella.
let's get into customer journey itself.
Yeah,
That's kind of important. At least that's kind of say the foundation for most of the stuff you're doing. And one of the things I think you told me the bit like, or at least you hear in reports, is like the best calls are the calls that never happen, right?
right, right, right.
And this notion of self-healing systems, self-serve, I mean, call deflection, it's been around for a fairly long time, right?
Yeah.
So let's start the discussion from your perspective around one, fundamentally, do you believe in that, right? Like all calls are bad calls, right? Or what's the framework? As because I'm sure, like if you think about from a customer experience strategy perspective, what's the right way to think about like
Yeah.
all calls bad?
So, first of all, I don't think it's easy to say all calls are bad or good, right? Call deflection may reduce costs, but it's not necessarily improving your loyalty or the experience, right? So basic answer there. The second is I think we're really getting into a world where what was AI, what is it intended as a broader topic to deliver? Hyper-personalization. And hyper-personalization suggests that in more omni-channel, right? And so that can be interacting through chat, it can be self-healing where there's a proactive interaction with you, or it can be talking to an agent to resolve something. And so I think that the strategy that most of my customers are thinking about is based on the segment of their population. And that could be, for example, premium customers, who have certain status, let's say, with an airline or a hotel versus, people who are more transactional, thinking about how would you route, or it can come back to preferences. What are self-declared preferences? But just coming back to this idea of where can technology and AI and generative AI and just the compute associated with this. I mean, there to me, it's really, can it proactively solve bulk problems without all of the individuals having to call into a call center? So, for example, we know that if there's a disruption on a flight, there's bad weather or something, the ability for it to identify who all the passengers are, rebook them, rebook their connections, alert them. I get it in my airline app alerting me that I'm going to miss my connection so that I can choose, am I going to stay in that city or try and get on another connection? Those sorts of things, just the speed and compute power now that we have and the ability to solve those non-standard issues, I think proactively positions the brand differently than waiting for now 600 people to get into a queue and try and manage sort of the peaks and valleys of that, of people calling in to do what is effectively a transactional task, right? I'm going to miss this flight. What's the next two flights available? Which one should I be on? And that sort of stuff I think is not actually new. I mean, more advanced brands have been pushing that towards their applications, their apps for a while. I think similarly, if you look in the travel space, the DOT has come out with some regulations around, sort of refunds for flight disruption. That sort of stuff, again, is a classic example of where we should be able to automate that. And then you really save, talking to an agent for more complex issues that are more analytical, more customized, right? So where a customer may be working through scenarios of what they want to book or how they want to think about their travel. And there you can really use the agent to apply all the different connections of policies and think through what the best alternatives are. It becomes more of an advisor than a service rep.
What's the flip side? I mean, to your point, or so like, how do you define kind of good interactions or interactions that you would want someone to call? Like, I mean, the
Yeah.
one that a disruption is a clear example. Automate it as much as possible. They are in distress. Kind of, you don't need people jumping on the phone and waiting for half an hour. But what's the flip side of it? Like, where you want the interaction to happen?
Yeah. So, we've been talking a lot internally within IGT Solutions around bifurcating, I'll call it transactions that
Mhm.
you want to bulk batch
Right.
and moments of delight,
Mm.
right? And a moment of delight could simply be, actually, we have a client who does this, and I think it's fantastic. I haven't seen it broadly, but uh, we field customer success agents for a brand where if anyone from the ground crew, the gate crew, or someone on that plane who's serving you sees you in a moment of distress, they can connect to our contact center, to our agents, to our advisors, and let them know that this passenger was in distress. And it could be something as simple as your food came and it was cold, whatever it might be. And we actually then have the passenger's contact information, their frequent flyer number to know what status of flyer they are, and we proactively outbound reach to that passenger to connect with them and understand what happened, illustrate that the brand wants to take the feedback and improve, and also figure out if there's any resolution that would delight them, right? That to me is really creating brand affinity and brand loyalty. I'm not sure that getting that in a chat or getting that, through an AI bot would have the same ability as someone showing empathy, acknowledging that they've been notified, acknowledging that this brand cares to understand and wants to take that feedback and see if there's anything they can do to resolve what happened. I think that's a great idea.
This is a great example. Where do you stand between, like, for instance, when I would call into a call center, when I would kind of reach out, probably one of one of your customers, uh, and for a airline flight ticket change, right?
Mhm.
Most of the time I will end up paying more for some reason or the other, getting out of that call. I mean, do you want to automate that? Do you actually want
No,
to?
of course not, right? You know, you
Yeah.
exactly. So that's exactly like and I think this will be interesting where agentics, because agentics is able to, contextualize and solve in a more multivariant. It's not a direct rules based. Otherwise, you should just go to the website and rebook your ticket and pay more, right? But the idea that like, I think many of us don't think through it, which is like, okay, there are three people traveling. We want to connect through Doha, but you as the agent might illustrate to me that if you connect through Dubai, it's a shorter connection and a cheaper flight. We think we want to fly business class, but that all depends on like what the options are that are available for the three of us to sit next to each other. I mean, that kind of thing at the end of the day requires a level of analytics that most of the technology that's there right now, RAG, those sorts of things can assist and aid or augment, but can't replace. Yeah, and that it increases your total ticket size, your value. Yeah.
Well, the ones that you bring in as we kind of like this section here, it's not like, yeah, self-healing systems. I mean, what I'm summarizing is like they're good, but they are not the only answer. You would want to talk to and interact with your customers in the right way. For some transactional stuff that makes no sense, kind of go and do it and just focus on
Yeah.
there. But there's a like everything else, there's some sort of an 80-20 kind of
Yeah.
focusing on where the
Well,
self-healing systems matter versus where actually they are
and
probably.
just think about it, like it's sort of this idea of supply and demand. If we go back to the initial premise, which is what we want is we want the brand to define what a consistent customer success experience is, right? And now you have a lot of people in the process, right? So you have to train people, whether it's on a call center, whether it's greeting people in a store. I mean, you are training people and people are not always 100% accurate. Technology is not always 100% accurate. And actually, I think that's an important thing you and I have talked about, which is we are holding AI to a higher standard than ourselves. But assume that you can train these people and that you give them enough pattern recognition that they're able to consistently do this. Now, why is it in retail that you see call centers staffing up at Christmas time or the holiday season? Because there's a higher volume of returns.
Yes.
Okay, when you have that type of surge staffing, you cannot train and give enough pattern recognition for consistent quality standards across all of those agents. And so, in those sort of surge environments, how can you use technology as a substitute to automate, to replace, so that the interactions that happen do always hit that bar of consistent high standard associated with that brand? And then you also take friction out of the system, which is no business. I mean, if you think about it, even healthcare, open
Yes.
enrollment, right?
Lumpy work.
Anything that's lumpy,
Yeah.
how can we think about disaggregating the tasks that can be
Yes.
automated so that you have a much more consistent layer of human capital, which you then have a better pipeline to train and manage so that it is consistent at the quality representing that brand? Yeah.
Big work in technology.
About their open enrollment or retail, or it could be an event based,
It's
like a
like,
weather
yeah,
pattern disruption.
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So moving on. So now let's say let's just following the customer journey here. You are at a you are making the call or you are opening up a chat window and talking to someone, right? And this notion around, I mean, we figured out the enablement one, the assist one. What I mean, this whole copilot stuff, we hear a lot about it. What really works in your opinion, what you have seen? Like, where is the human and I mean, we all talk about human plus machine, like with machine and like human in the loop and vice versa. What have you seen work in real life situations?
Yeah. So I was interested to see a recent, jobs in the future with AI research that came out that really sort of resonated for me, which is, we've seen, I think, generative AI, for example, really, I think, progress in two spaces. One is content creation, and that's a broad space, but content creation. And the other is, in my mind, code generation.
Mhm.
Both of these are generating, whether it's in code or in images or language, they're generating text, right? And I think that as a first use case for, my space, generating emails, generating chats and then having the agents basically as the co-pilot
Mm.
approve those, right, is a very useful and good use case, right? Because it actually, I saw recent research that said those that are using those sorts of use cases, agents are clearing 15% more units, capacity per day than not. So what you're doing is you're taking kind of like post-call transcript, you're taking summarization, you're taking creation, and you're putting it so the human is actually looking at it and then accepting or modifying. And to be honest, oftentimes you have agents who are working maybe in a second language. And so the ability to generate that content in the primary language, in English, for example, and then have someone look over it, you end up with better grammar, better ontology of those emails or chats, et cetera. So I think that's a really good one. The second one is, look, in spaces like healthcare or financial services or travel, all of which we work across, where there are policies, and the policies oftentimes are quite complex. That RAG, the ability to serve up the right policy so that the agent doesn't have to memorize it. Again, we're working within defined data sets on sort of small language models, right? So it's highly accurate and then presents for the agent what they need to know in that moment, as opposed to trying to train them to remember, a month later when they encounter that situation, what that policy is. So that to me is another fantastic example of where you can take some of that stress off of the human or the agent or the advisor, and you can allow them to work with the end consumer to resolve the issue, having the policy in hand.
And what has been the reaction of the agents using these tools? I mean, what are they happy with it, or are they see this as a threat? What's been the experience?
Yeah, I think that on both of those examples, those are actually, if you think about it, I mean, just coming back to being served up something you can modify, right? You can approve, or being given relevant information in front of you. If you can get to the place where agents trust, right, which goes back to this sort of like, how do you get agents to understand that this is working with them? I see it as, you know, working pretty seamlessly. I think the areas where I'm still seeing there to be a challenge is where there are handoffs between an AI agent and a human agent. And just making sure of how that handoff is happening. Those sorts of things I see less of yet, to be honest, in production in the market. And those are more substitutes if you think about it, versus the first are really assisting. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's the kind of, it seems like the maturity is in that enablement to
Yeah.
assist. That's kind of it's going.
Yeah, and I know you do a ton of work, or we've talked about like in service to sales, kind of customer success type of use cases. I'd be curious, Amresh, what you're seeing.
On the customer success and service to sales aspect of it, the examples that we see, this whole notion of standardization, that pattern recognition, I think that's the
Yep.
biggest thing, right? Because most of these, even like sales, it's you don't meet the quota and suddenly you're out, and so there's a lot of like churn, right, on
Right.
this thing, and it takes time for someone to understand those patterns. To your point, I think that's that standardization around like similar example, whether it's like looking for policies on a responding to a kind of a call, to looking for, hey, here is the right product configuration and the right pricing guideline I have to actually do
Yep.
an offer. And by the way, this is the right starting point to have a discussion with. Those kind of things you can standardize a lot, and for the bottom quartile, you can move them up fairly quickly.
Move them up. Yeah.
That's kind of this thing. What's really interesting is for the experts, right? For the and because and for the experts who are there, and we are seeing it to one of our clients, they are in some ways the value proposition for them is they are actually training the system so that they can train their colleagues much faster. That's essentially kind of what is there. So yeah, they because most of the time what actually happens, there are informal networks, and they'll be like, hey, how do I deal with this, how do I deal with that?
Yeah.
You are, a lot of the time is gets spent on that. So the value proposition is, hey, why didn't you just spend the time training the system, because I think everyone else will pick up from your knowledge around it. But then how do you actually compensate, or how do you make the person who's actually training the AI system a hero? Those are the kind of things that I think still, that incentive model, I think, is still getting figured out
Yeah.
in many ways, especially in the sales kind of scenario, or I could see in your scenario also. So that I think is probably still in play. The other thing is, even for experts, coming up with, even normally experts tend to have tunnel vision, which is, here are the four things that work for me all the time. but the other expert, the same four things that work for them could be actually different four things. There are actually six things that work. And this notion around, hey, here, it's more of a almost like a suggestion. Like if you're going to say, this is what I'm trying to think of, trying to do, what are the different ways of approaching it, right? It's idea generator kind of a notion. So it's a
Yeah.
lot more, I would say, less standard, more ideas level and value proposition level that I think
Yeah.
works for the more skilled people.
I also think it starts to speak to you were using this phrase expert, and I've been thinking a lot about this, right? Like, so just take travel booking platforms.
Yes.
Many of us use them, whether it's an Expedia or a Priceline or
Yes.
whatever it is, right? Typically, historically, agents would have been trained to be expert in a product,
Mm.
right? So they're expert in car rentals or
Correct.
hotels. But increasingly, as everyone is looking, as you talked about earlier, to expand the sort of the size of the booking, we're looking at really bundling across all of those products. And so expertise is becoming broader. And even the expert who maybe has spent 5 or 6 years working in a very narrow humans, if we think about, we've talked about the future of work, it's about empathy. It's no longer being the tech. So I think there's also benefit even for the expert, although the research shows like the greatest benefit is for the novice. I think as we redefine what expertise is, as you started this whole thing in the first episode of how do we rewire work,
Yeah.
right? And as we think about that, then the job changes, right? And I've been thinking a lot about this even in the call center space. Expertise is oftentimes in terms of language competency, right? Like when you're recruited, that's what we're actually looking for is, how you communicate, but your language competency in whatever language is being looked for. Well, in the future, when you can actually, right now there's a lot of latency, but translate live, then what is the expertise? The expertise is the ability to get to the outcome. The expertise is the speed at which you can resolve a problem. It's those sorts of things. And so even the expert, I think, becomes changed and aided with this technology in the future, if you would.
Where they actually go and tackle the situation, and they talk about what is domain expertise, right? And
Right.
and they did it in a like a kind of a lab of 1,000 scientists, so everyone was an expert there, right?
Mhm.
And what they figured out, I mean, I want to just if you want to summarize, is an expert is not something who understand what needs to be done
Yeah.
at a high proficiency level. It's they define expert. Eventually, the true experts are the people who have an intuition about that. It's like they can look around the corners,
Yeah.
which is not kind of documented this and that. So it's about not about so they decide proficiency, high degree of proficiency is not expertise. Expertise is around actually intuition around your subject area. And I think this notion around who is an expert is a great point. And that's a fantastic paper to kind of starts laying out because the experts of the future are going to be kind of measured in a different way than to your point,
Yeah.
language expertise.
Well, and I think two things I've been thinking about a lot there. One is, intuition, or, maybe you just say you're born with a good gut. A lot of it is actually having context,
Yes,
right? And so now we can use technology to take someone who's maybe never been on an airplane
yes.
and simulate the experience of what a passenger is, or who's, never been to Macy's in New York City and simulated. So a lot of the context now can be anywhere. It actually changes this idea of socioeconomics and where should jobs and work go. But then the second is if you think about again, and I'm a big believer, there are certain geographies who historically, when you thought about language, didn't win in the call center world. Like India was not a big winner on voice. But in the future, if India has, I mean, just the scale of its workforce and the scale of knowledge workers that it can produce vis-a-vis many other countries in the world, if language isn't the barrier, if accent isn't the barrier, then who's the winner? And I think that there are certain economies, and I use India as an example, but if you were to just go back to the standard matrix, it would say, how many people do you have? What's the education layer? And like, how many people speak this language at this proficiency? You have to turn that exam question fundamentally upside down now and say, well, what geographies can produce skilled labor so that you don't get to saturation, which is a big problem in the industry, right? Like you've reached saturation in certain markets, so then the job market becomes very difficult from skilling, training, all those things, versus certain countries now who I think can win at a different scale and level than they could before.
So this kind of goes to the, I think you're addressing that. You actually see AI to changing, like an agent with a AI, the skill set, the profile is going to start looking different than not probably a much more traditional kind of a current state process or current state agent today. Is that kind of where
Yeah.
you're going and you're thinking that's going to happen?
Yeah, I think first of all, I mean, let me give like a very tangible example. Like we're seeing cities like take because I'm headed there in a couple days with my family, Jaipur, that wouldn't have been thought of maybe as a voice contact center market,
Right.
now actually can be thought of that way because they have access to the right talent pools, but you can use all sorts of accent neutralization, and then you can use all sorts of language translation tools to facilitate that language is not the barrier. The real question is, can you find the right, sort of employable talent pools who then have that skill set you were talking about, the expertise as it's redefined?
So basically, intuition, like more kind of in the gray kind of decision making in the gray.
Yeah,
I mean, those are
yeah.
softer skills rather than
Softer skills. And that's where like I think you also find and we're seeing this like when you think about certain geographies, for years the Philippines was a big contact center market. I would say that it really is tremendous at customer care and service. But if you start to look into what you're building some co-pilots and tools around, which is service to sales, where now actually the quotient switches to more of, the skill set, the expertise is the intuition around how to sell.
yes,
Not everyone's great about that. Those are two different skill sets. They're oftentimes defined by sort of culturally two different sets of
yeah.
backgrounds. And so now how do you start to think more about the expertise? The expertise is to the job, the skill, not the language, if that makes sense.
I'll just put it in a very different way and react to it, which is, I mean, you and I have talked about human in the loop versus AI in the loop, right? And there's
Yeah.
one definition, a very simplistic definition, is human in the loop is when you listen to the AI as the AI says, versus AI in the loop is you know when to define the AI and kind of or when you define the machine and do the right thing. And that intuition is requires a different set of skill sets than the first one. Is that
Well, yeah, I think you're right. I think you're spot on there. But human in the loop, a lot of people have talked about it. Like what you were saying earlier, the human is training AI. There's a prediction given to the human. The human either approves that that is right or not right. And what you and I just talked about earlier, which I think about as a little bit of a fallacy in that definition, is assuming that the human or the AI is more accurate.
yeah,
I mean, whereas AI in the loop is actually AI taking core things, whether it's again, accent, basic language, whether it's retrieval of information, search, and serving it up to the human to do their job and amplify the human skills, which I think then both are maximizing their potential.
right.
Does that make sense? Like you're actually you're getting to a point where the sum is greater because of the two versus the first seems more like one is optimizing the other.
Yeah.
And I think we've already talked about like it may not actually be optimizing. It's not clear that even training by humans to AI is going to get to a more overtime optimal outcome.
The pie goes is going to become bigger. There's a potential
I think it
pie
will,
becoming
for
bigger
sure.
when you think about AI in the loop versus
Yeah.
human.
And I was just listening to like Ravi Kumar from Cognizant talking on something, and I sort of admire him, and he was answering this question of productivity and like what is it going to do to jobs. And I thought there were two things he said that really stuck with me. The first is that in all of these technology revolutions that we've had over decades, and they are different. This one has different traits, and we can talk about that, but productivity typically has lagged by anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And the more that I'm reading and research, it's also saying productivity here will lag, but there will be productivity created. If you think about it, if I can generate 7 email responses, that is an improvement in productivity, which is what we need for our economies to kickstart back to the kind of growth that we need them at. So rather than this like doomsday discussion of jobs are going to be destroyed, I actually look at it as over time, there is more productivity in the system. The second thing he said is, look, if you look in the world of coding, and I agree that anything, if you look through the lens of skills, we are short on skills in the world, right? So yes, actually, a lot of code, he was saying, has already been being generated by AI or by automation for years, and maybe 20% was being generated. Maybe now it'll be 40%, but the fact is we're still short resources. And so it's more about dispersion of labor, skilling labor, and recognizing that actually the world we all want to live in is where there's more growth.
Right.
More growth begets more skills, you know? Yeah.
Katie, we will continue the conversation later. It's
Yeah.
always fun to kind of have a conversation where you can go from specific examples to very macro discussions and some philosophical discussions all at the same time. It's always a lot of fun, but
Thanks for having me, Amresh. Appreciate it.
AuxoAI. What if? What's next?